Alrighty, folks, welcome again and thank you for being here today. As people trickle in, I would like to welcome you to another WIAA and UW Center for Leadership and Athletics Women As session. Today's hour will be run by the center's staff and is jam-packed with content. So with that said, please keep your mics muted as they were upon entry, but please feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat as we go along. The speakers may not have time to answer them directly during the session, but staff from the center will be monitoring the chat and compiling them to help shape the follow-up discussion during breakout sessions. A quick reminder that today's session is being recorded, so it will be made available via email and the WI website for those who either missed or had to leave early today. With that said, it is my pleasure to hand it off to my good friend and colleague, Hannah Olson, Assistant Director at UW Center for Leadership and Athletics.
Awesome. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Sam. One of my favorite people, just a lovely human. Thanks for being here today, everyone. I'm honored to be in front of you today as a fellow educator, leader, and coach. I interacted with many of you at the Women in Sports Leadership Conference back in November. And I left that 3-day experience feeling energized and just really hungry to fuel that proverbial gender equity fire. I've been part of the Washington sports scene my entire life, and I honestly believe that something special is happening here, that we're in a moment, we're in a tipping point, and I'm excited to be part of it. Like many of you, I see an opportunity to radically shift the current sports landscape for women and girls if we can continue to act with purpose and intentionality, seeking support from the other folks in this room and fellow co-conspirators. So today I'm going to do my part to throw a little gasoline on the fire as we discuss creating positive culture and the challenges that women face as culture navigators and builders. Here we go. A dear friend of mine, she lovingly refers to my coaching career as the one-woman cleanup crew. And what she means by that is that historically, I've had a knack for landing in coaching positions where programs have been left in just total disarray. Parent-led revolts, causing resignations, previous coaches fired, investigations underway, you get the idea. In some cases, I went into those situations completely unaware. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. I was 23 and very arrogant. I just needed a paying job. I didn't do my homework. You get the idea. In these scenarios, I bumped and bumbled my way through them and using trial and error just to better understand how to get better as a coach. In other cases, I've knowingly walked into tough situations with what I thought was a strong plan and maybe fancying myself a bit of a superhero coming to save the day. And I've had some masterful seasons as a cleanup crew, some not so much, but both have taught me really incredible lessons in culture development. And I've tried to pull those forward into my work as an educator and coach developer at the UW Center for Leadership and Athletics. So in today's session, we are going to think about culture from several different angles. First, we're going to spend time defining what culture is and what it looks like in youth sports settings. I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Dylan Karchner, who's going to tell you more about our coaching research at the UW CLA. He's going to share high leverage, research-based strategies that we've found are effective in building and fostering positive culture. We believe these strategies are universal, not just for women, not just for coaches, not just for administrators. So I encourage you to think about how they fit within your context and how you might use them in your specific role. I'm going to get the baton back to finish the session with tensions that exist specifically for women as both culture builders and navigators, because we can't get through a full workshop with the CLA if we're not fanning the gender equity fire. Am I right? Am I right? Okay, so let's do this. What is culture?
Culture is everything. Culture will hang a lot of banners. Culture, 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 culture that we have.
We've got to have a culture change. Culture change.
We're going to change the culture.
Complete change of culture.
Build our culture.
Build the right culture.
Build a great culture.
Build a culture.
Build a culture here.
Set a culture. Set your culture. If you have the right culture, anything is possible. Create culture.
Culture is about people.
Culture is in place.
Culture in place.
Culture.
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 Culture. Culture. Culture. Culture. Establish a culture from day one.
Set a culture. Create a culture that would produce results. Produce results to create a culture. Create a culture that produced results. Create this culture. Build the culture. Culture. Culture.
Culture. Everybody uses the word.
Culture. It's a term we throw around a lot in sports. And seemingly, based on these men's basketball coaches that we see here, it's the secret sauce for many successful coaches and teams. So what is it? At the center, we like to think about culture as repeated touch points. The messaging that we routinely hear, that we see, that we feel. And these behaviors and communications are internalized by members of a team or a group, and you make sense of that messaging. Your collective understanding and interpretation of how you're internalizing that makes up the team culture. In my experience as an athlete, I've often heard the phrase, it's the way we do things around here, or it's what we're about. And really, that's just a mirror of an underlying value set. When I was getting recruited to play collegiate softball, I got my first look from the University of Virginia at a recruiting combine because the whistle blew for us to rotate fields, and I stayed at the one I was at and picked up all the balls in the outfield. For me, it was just simply what was expected on the team that I was on. But for the UVA recruiting coordinator, it was reflective of the culture they were trying to develop at that institution. We'll spend a lot of time on this particular notion as we proceed through the session. Let me give you another example outside of sport. Disney's known for its strong corporate culture and has a really highly regarded training program for folks that want to be part of that culture and become employees. There's an accountability within the organization to ensure that guests have a super high quality experience at the happiest place on earth and other Disney properties. So let's imagine that you're at Disneyland. It's very likely that if you see a piece of trash on the ground, a Disneyland employee is going to swoop through like one of those little bald kids at Wimbledon and pick it up and drop it in the trash. It's all part of their accountability to create magical guest experiences. The behavior, picking up the trash, is a tiny moment that paints a partial picture of a larger culture at hand. Doug Lemov, a researcher and author in teacher education and coaching, adds something important to this definition, I think. He brings up an idea around intentionality and purpose. He says, culture is built in 1,000 smaller moments when we're not fully aware that we're building it. The aggregate message of those moments is at least influential as the moments we are aware that we're building culture. Mr. Lemov is describing the way in which culture is constantly being built, both intentionally and unintentionally. On one hand, we can build space, we can talk about culture, we can set up our practices and competitions that provides athletes opportunities to engage with our cultural values. And Dylan's going to spend time on this later in the session. But on the other hand, the things that we say, the things that we're doing every day contribute to culture, whether you intend them to or not. Every team has a culture, good or bad, and it's continually being shaped by words, actions, beliefs, and understandings. The imagery of an iceberg is a really powerful way to think about this. Up top, above the waterline, we have the visible. Structures, behaviors, actions, traditions. Above the waterline is that what we say and do, and we make explicit. Examples could be a list of team rules or expectations, the way that we speak to our athletes, the ritual of a pregame meal, written team goals, a departmental mission statement, a team slogan that's posted on the locker room. We could make a list a mile long, but you get the idea. Excuse me. Underneath the surface, however, is where the magic happens or doesn't. This is where the implicit and invisible elements of culture reside. Values, assumptions, perceptions, beliefs, feelings that are held by the folks that are part of your team or group. Athletes, yes, but also parents, the rest of your coaching staff, athletic administration. All these stakeholders are taking the stated and visible, internalizing, and making sense of it beneath the waterline. This process is occurring, as our buddy Doug Lemov stated, whether you're intending it to or not. So culture is developing through even the smallest touch points. And if you're not attending to problematic or toxic behavior that's below that waterline, you have a problem. For example, in many girls and women's sports, there's a very specific culture that's developed around body image and eating. Athletes are going to have their own notions and assumptions about their bodies and food. So whether you choose or not to address it in a team context or not doesn't matter. So why not take the opportunity to attend to it, bring it above the waterline, and shape those understandings in a healthy and positive way? As a coach, even if our culture seems strong, we have to be curious. We have to put on a detective hat and we have to ask, am I missing anything? We're going to see a great example of this in this next video clip that features Becky Burley, who's the head soccer coach at the University of Florida. Here we go. Maybe. All right, here we go.
How many people like getting subbed out of a game? So less than half. Well, we haven't found anybody on our team that likes getting subbed out either, but I'm going to tell you about a tool that we used on our bench this year that really impacted us, and that was our bench cam. So what our bench cam was set up to do was, if we take a look at our team, we have a soccer team that had 25 people on it last year. We play 11 people on the field at one time, which means we have 14 people on the bench. We have more people on the bench than we do on the field. And what we have just made clear is that nobody likes being on the bench. So that's an area of your team that your culture can really go downhill if you're not paying attention to it. So we decided we were going to pay attention to it. So it was a really simple setup. We just took a camera, stuck it on a tripod, stuck it on the very end of the bench so that it faced the last player on the bench all the way down to the coaches. Keyword, coaches were also on the bench cam. So we were all being filmed every single game by this bench cam. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. I'm going to introduce you to a player on our team. Her name is Liz. She is one of the most hardworking players on our team, and she has really, really high standards for herself. So when she doesn't meet those standards, she gets frustrated. So this is us playing Stanford this past fall. And when a player comes out of the game for us, I really make it a point to speak to the player before they head to the bench. And I also like to make contact with the player physically. And the reason for that is because it's been proven that touch can lower stress levels in the athletes. So here I am talking to Liz as she comes off the field. I don't think she's really excited about my decision. And you can see that in her body language and her missing a couple high fives. And in this face right here. So what happens next is that Liz comes over. In our sport, you have to put on a penny to delineate you from the players who are playing on the field. She has now left the bench cam, but comes back. We get pretty excited. We think she's going to be there, but she leaves again. So at this point, she has separated herself from the team and kind of isolated herself. And now one of our seniors, Annie, has recognized that she's off of the camera and separating herself from the team. She tells Val, another one of the players on our team, and then she says, I'm going to go talk to her, and they both get a little nervous, as you can tell. So when I showed this to Liz, the amazing thing about this was she really was frustrated by the way that she looked. She had no idea that she had that look on her face, and she was pretty mortified by it. And I'm telling you, this is a kid that I love to coach, and I think for her, she just had no idea what that face looked like when she was in her own head. When I also showed this to her, I stopped the camera when Annie, the senior, goes to talk to Liz. And for 3 more minutes, the two of them are off camera. And I said to her, well, you know, Annie hasn't even been in this game yet. She's a senior. You've been in this game and have come out. How do you think that went over? And that really hit her. That really hit her to the point where she was like, I'm going to make a concerted effort to never do that again. And she did. So sometimes it's just seeing what's happening helps it. So I think Sue mentioned it earlier, measuring it. If you measure it, then you pay attention to it.
So there's a lot to take away from this video, but the main thing that I hope you noticed is how the coaches at Florida are intentionally and directly attending to that bottom of the iceberg. In this case, the feelings and beliefs of the bench players, and they're bringing them above the waterline. The coaching staff's getting curious. Our reserve players is engaged as we want them to be, and to the level that we expect as part of this team and part of this culture. The bench cam, therefore, is essentially for Florida soccer a measurement tool for their culture. It's brilliant and a wonderful way to think about doing the work to investigate your culture and look for areas that could use more attention. While it may not be reasonable, excuse me, y'all have my throat struggling today. While it may not be reasonable to situate this tool in a middle or high school setting, I think you can get the idea how similar results could be achieved by attending to what a critical mass of your athletes are thinking and feeling. So with that, I'd like you to rummage up a piece of scratch paper, an old napkin, an old receipt, whatever you can find, and take 1 minute to pause and reflect. And I want you to think about a culture that you drive or that you have responsibility in driving, and think about which elements define your culture. So which elements above that waterline, those that are visible, drive your culture. And our DJ, Sam Brown, is going to play some tunes for us, and we'll come back in 1 minute. Thank you, DJ Sam Brown, always spinning the sick tunes. All right. Thanks for taking a brief minute to capture an idea or two. I know that's not a sufficient amount of time to reflect at all that we're going to toss at you, but maybe just by hitting the pause button and capturing a few keywords, you'll be able to go back and double click on some of those ideas later. So let's continue the conversation and think about alignment of cultural elements, those things that are above and below the waterline. You're going to have a serious issue with your team or your organization if the values and beliefs that are visible are at odds with those that are not. So I played for a coach that touted the importance of academics, but if we asked to come to practice late for a tutoring session or skip an optional training to study, he really pushed back on us, which is a lack of alignment. I've seen coaches who preach accountability to their teams, but then themselves show up late and unprepared for practice. Lack of alignment. Some teams have underclassmen that carry all the team gear and clean up all the equipment after practices, but then have together written on their team shirts. Yes, lack of alignment. The inability to attend to the invisible and align the things that we can't see with the things that we can see is a culture killer. It creates confusion for the athletes and a lack of trust within your community. Back in the day, I accepted a varsity head coaching job with a group of very ambitious and very talented young women. The league that I was participating in was very competitive, and over the last few years, the team just couldn't quite get over the hump to make a splash in postseason play. The talent was there, but there was just something that was holding them back. And our new coaching staff came in, and we quickly learned that that something was culture. There are a ton of issues to contend with. I could probably write a book about my years with that team. But there's one that I want to highlight quickly that I think illustrates this idea of alignment really nicely. Historically, this team had had a culture that required a really singular focus on the season. It was expected that if you were part of the varsity team, that you ignored other sports, your outside passions, you were all in. Well, it just so happens that this runs counter to my beliefs as a school-based coach, and we made it very clear from the jump as a coaching staff that we wanted folks to be able to participate in different things, and we wanted them to have an option to be part of different activities and fuel their passions as young people. We didn't want them to have to choose. The problem was that this hyper-focused all-in culture had existed for years on this team, and we couldn't quite kick it. So we had some really serious feelings of resentment, particularly from the upperclassmen who had been forced into this model when we allowed people to miss practices and competitions to allow for other things in their lives. So we knew that we had to really intentionally attend to this tension, bring it above the waterline, if you will, in an effort to move ourselves towards alignment. Otherwise, that darn iceberg was gonna sink our ship. Another example, in the summer of 2020, Kara Lawson was hired as the head basketball coach at Duke University. If you're not familiar, Kara is a really highly decorated athlete, coach, broadcaster, and her hire at Duke was a really big deal in collegiate athletics. Her initial press conferences after she was hired were all about developing relationships with her athletes, developing the whole person, beginning to establish trust, and talking about that being part of Duke basketball was more than just basketball. So as the team moved into the fall, these messages became very visible through team behavior. And to me, as an outsider, were seemingly a reflection of the culture that Lawson was developing at Duke, was and is. So words on their jerseys, getting athletes registered to vote, holding community events to facilitate social justice conversations, and so on. Here's a short clip of Coach Lawson on ESPN talking about her onboarding with Duke and some of her recent experiences.
Krzyzewskiville. Men's basketball coach Mike Krzyzewski spoke, as did their women's head coach Kara Lawson, who was hired to lead their program this offseason. Joined now by a former colleague, a friend, one of the most respected people when she was at our shop, and now she's a head coach at Duke. It's Kara Lawson. Coach, it's great to talk to you under these circumstances, even though I had to give you a hard time. Yeah, of all the places, you had to pick that team in that town, huh?
I love it here, man. I know. There's a lot of history between your Terps and the Blue Devils, but as you know, it's a great place. Tradition, college basketball here is awesome. So I'm thrilled to be in Durham. It's a special place, and the opportunity to impact young women in a real way, young women that are going to change the world. I mean, some of the brightest minds in the world come to study at Duke, and I couldn't pass it up. It's a chance to run my own program and to chase after a national championship. To me, it was a pretty easy decision.
You talk about influencing young women. How are these young women influencing you in this time in this country? And you all met on campus at Duke on Thursday. We showed some of that. We showed some of what you had to say. But how are these young women impacting you with their hearts and their minds right now?
Some of the best parts of my day are when I get a chance to talk one-on-one with our players. And I've spent a lot of time with them. This is unique when you have a coaching change. I'm not the person that went into their homes, that recruited them, that got to know their families, that went through this process with them. And I think already in this short time, I mean, I don't know if you saw the whole video, but the way they came up to stand beside me in my moment of need, that's why you coach, man. Like that's why you coach, is to be able to have a group of young women that are together and that are solidly behind you as a leader.
You play for.
So what I notice in this video is this mutual respect, right, between athletes and coach. And she talks about her ability to impact lives, not impact basketball players, but impact young women who are finding their way in this world. And it's not lost on me that coach also is very well aware of everything that they're bringing to her life as well. So Duke basketball has ultimately landed here. They opted out for the remainder of the 2021 season for the health and safety of their student athletes. And no matter how you feel about the confluence of COVID and participation in sports, I think that we can all agree that honoring the wishes of athletes to ensure their health and well-being is just sound coaching and leadership. This is alignment, folks. It's congruency between what's visible and stated and invisible and understood. From the athlete standpoint here, I'm valued, I'm safe, I trust my coach. These feelings of trust and safety are a baseline for positive culture. If the environment is one that ensures physical and emotional safety, there's an opportunity to create feelings of belonging that really help move us towards a powerful whole. I'm going to ask you to reflect one more time. And this time I'd like you to consider something that's below the waterline in your culture. What's something that you're not talking about that's implicit or visible, but it should be, and it should be brought above the waterline? Sam, you mind spinning some tunes for us? Thanks. Again, thank you, Sam. And thank you, folks, for taking a moment to capture something that has got your wheels turning at the moment. And now I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Dylan Karchner, who is a teaching and research associate on our team at the UW-CLA. He's a really valuable part of our staff. He brings perspective as a youth coach, and he brings that into his research and training. Maybe my favorite thing about him is that he always says that he gets to work with a bunch of badass women. So with that, I'll hand it off to you. Take it away, Dylan.
Thank you, Hannah, and thanks to everyone again for joining today. I'm going to talk about ambitious coaching and how the core practices can serve as a foundation for culture building. To start, I'm quickly going to recap some of the key points that Hannah mentioned. We talked about the baseline for a positive culture being the feelings of trust and safety, the need for congruency and alignment between the visible and invisible elements of the iceberg, and the idea of repeated touch points, how the behaviors we routinely see and the messaging we routinely hear contributes to this collective understanding of what makes up team culture. As coaches and leaders, we all play an essential role in establishing and maintaining the culture. So if you were to think about how you may define coaching, my guess is that your response would somehow relate to the idea of coaching being a transformational process. And if you were to think how you may define good coaching, your answers may range from athletes learning in different ways and recognizing that, to winning games or championships, to seeing and helping your athletes grow within and outside of sport. It's important to recognize that there's no one way to coach or lead. Each of you do different things to be effective and have your own styles that work for your situation. But what if we could get at the common strategies and actions that make coaches most effective, regardless of age, sport, or competition level? And that is where ambitious coaching comes into play. But before I jump into ambitious coaching, I'll just share a bit about where I'm coming from in relation to the work. Like many of you, I am also a coach. I've been coaching for a few years now, but if you were to ask my younger sister how long I've been coaching, she'd probably say I've been coaching a lot longer than that. I've been grateful to have a wide range of experiences with coaches. I was a multi-sport athlete throughout high school and had the opportunity to be a practice player for women's basketball teams at the collegiate and professional level. And through my experiences, I've been around coaches who have been awesome and who have made playing the sport more fun. But I've also been around coaches who just always found a way to bring this negative energy and kill the vibe. You don't want to be that coach. My first coaching experience was my senior year at the University of Connecticut, where I got to work with the women's club basketball team, and I'll share more about that later. And since then, I've had the opportunity to coach middle school, high school, and travel basketball teams. And in 2019, was able to coach camps and clinics over a 3-week span in Japan. So by no means do I have coaching all figured out. I am learning right alongside you all and have plenty to learn from you all. But what I do have, however, as Hannah alluded to, is the opportunity to work with a badass group of women who specialize in coach development and have researched the idea of ambitious coaching. So the Ambitious Coaching Project, led by Dr. Julie McCleary and the team at the UW Center for Leadership and Athletics, is an effort to centralize a baseline of standard coaching strategies that are applicable across disciplines, sports, age groups, and competition levels. The project was launched in 2016 as a research study designed to identify the knowledge and the skills at the heart of effective coaching. Ambitious coaching is an interdisciplinary approach to coaching and is a response to a need within the field of coaching. For context, ambitious coaching is mapped onto the concept of ambitious teaching, which is a shift from a focus on teaching specific subject matter elements to a focus on how teachers can best work with kids. So when we think about excellent teachers and what they do, for example, a math teacher, should they know how to teach the specifics of algebra really well? Or should they know how to teach each kid really well? The answer, as many of you likely presumed, is both. And this same idea applies to a coach. How can a coach balance the teaching of the sport with the holistic development of their athletes? Effective coaches connect high-level athletic performance with social emotional growth and well-being. And this is the idea that the Ambitious Coaching Project looked into more. The result are 15 core practices designed to elicit both peak athletic performance and social emotional development. We know that sport skill building and social emotional development reinforce one another. And these are the highest leverage strategies, moves, and actions that coaches can take to facilitate positive outcomes for athletes. So take a quick moment to look these over. And as you do, it's important to note that these are not just a checklist of how to be a great coach, and they don't all hold an equal space of importance. These are a set of high leverage activities that overlap and are intertwined with one another. As Hannah mentioned, culture building and culture maintenance is a never-ending process. Our behaviors and our messaging are constantly reinforcing the culture, whether we want them to or not. Many of these core practices are actions and strategies that you're already using, but our cultures are built based off of the intention behind these core practices, or the lack thereof. So how do we use core practices as a foundation for culture building? One way to think about this is through the acronym of a caring culture. This acronym helps us get at the ideas of creating a safe and trusting environment, aligning the visible and invisible elements of the iceberg, and facilitating the repeated touch points. There's no sequential order to this acronym, and similarly to the core practices, all of these elements are connected and have a lot of overlap between them. So let's begin thinking about the ways that these are connected and can be utilized to build culture. And as you'll see, we're going to spend a bit more time on certain elements of this acronym. We'll begin with routines. So we've mentioned this idea of repeated touch points, the behaviors we routinely see, the messaging we routinely hear. Routines serve as the structure for other elements of the caring culture. So if you focus on nothing else after today, focus on routines. We're going to show a quick video of the UW volleyball routine at the beginning of each practice. And this video was captured as part of the Ambitious Coaching Research Project. As you watch this video, it's about a minute long. Think about the potential impacts of these routines.
Today.
But I kept it and it's better.
Okay. There's a lot of details to get right, and nothing that you do, even though it sounds simple, is simple. You got to do a lot of little things right to make it come together. So let's just make today a little better day. Okay. Kind of a heavy day yesterday, being a double day, and then also just a lot of hitting reps. You all took about 60 swings each, which is a little on the higher end. So a little bit less today, a little more serve and pass and defense. We'll have a hitter tournament at the end. Okay. Let's go.
Do it, Daddy. Have a good day, Josh. Something, what do you think, Josh?
You can stop the video, Hannah. Thank you. So notice how the coach is setting aside time to communicate and check in with each athlete. In the conversations, he's listening to their feedback, and they're setting goals for the day based on both of their input, which is a process of shared decision making. So routines are important because they create consistency and opportunity for repetition. They allow athletes to know what to expect, which lowers athlete anxiety and builds that trust that's necessary for risk-taking and growth. Each of you likely have your own routines that are connected to your sport, specific ways you warm up or that you begin or end each practice, maybe some drills you do within practice or even some in-game routines. And there's a lot of potential ways to integrate routines into your coaching. We can establish routines related to training, competition, communication, logistics, and social emotional development, all of which have the potential to serve as benchmarks and touch points for athletes. We can see some routines like how we begin practice or what our pregame warm-up looks like, but routines also take place below the waterline. While we can see people communicating with one another, like we just did in the video, the messaging within the communication is what creates alignment below the surface. So here are some examples of communication routines that help build a strong culture. We constantly need to be mindful of our tone. Since culture is made up of the messaging we routinely hear, it's no surprise that negative messaging will lead to a negative culture. It's easier to develop skills, both sport skills and social emotional skills, when athletes understand the intention behind the activity. And we can normalize the importance of these social emotional skills by routinely integrating them into our activities, and then naming the skills in action and calling them out when we see them. So for example, say one of our team values is support, and we're at a practice running a drill and 2 players collide and fall to the ground. Happens all the time. Nearby teammates hustle over to help them out. And as a coach, we can take this time to quickly stop the drill and call out that we've just seen an act of support. By verbalizing the action of support, we normalize and reinforce support as a value. And by modeling this as a coach, the athletes can then take on the naming of these skills themselves. If athletes recognize that the integration and naming of social emotional skills is a norm, it'll be easier for them to develop these skills. As coaches and leaders, we also need to value the voice of our team. A key part of communicating is listening. And if athletes and staff are routinely given the space to share their ideas, it helps reinforce this culture of trust, respect, and feeling valued. As individuals, we want to have the opportunity to make choices instead of always having things forced upon us. So now think about the perception of your team. Are they always being told what to do? Or do they also have a say at times for what they want the goals to be, or what theme they want to be worth extra points during a scrimmage? By normalizing and providing your team autonomy of the goals, you improve their receptiveness to the goals that you may have for them. Some of you may be familiar with the strategy that Steve Kerr explored using a few years ago. So you might have seen this before, but we're going to go ahead and check this out.
Letting the players actually run the huddles for this game. He takes the grease board and he hands it to Andre Iguodala. Guess who's coaching the timeouts and the huddles tonight? The Golden State Warrior players are going to do this themselves, and the coaches have abdicated responsibility and given this game to the players.
So this was done in the midst of the Warriors going to 5 consecutive NBA Finals appearances. And throughout that game, the players rotated who controlled the timeouts and drew up the plays. And they did this strategy a couple times throughout the year. And here's a 1-minute clip of Kerr talking about his decision to do this after the first time he tried it out.
Noticed that during the timeouts you were having your players coach. Was it something you prepared, you wanted them to do, you told them was going to happen, or was that spur of the moment decision to turn it over to your guys?
I told them the other night after the last game that we were going to do it. You know, it's their team. I think that's one of the first things you have to consider as a coach. It's not your team. It's not Bob Myers' team. It's not Joe Lakers' team. Although I'm not going to tell Joe that. It's the players' team. It's their team, and they have to take ownership of it. And as coaches, our job is to nudge them in the right direction, guide them. We don't control them. They determine their own fate. And I don't feel like we focused well at all the last month. And it just seemed like the right thing to do. And I thought they communicated really well together, and they drew up some.
So notice how Steve Kerr refers to the idea of it being his players' team, and that this is his way of reaching his players. By stepping away and allowing his team space, he was able to strengthen his connection with them in a time where he mentioned he felt disconnected. So the common thread through all of our communications is that they should be positively framed. We want to normalize a culture of encouragement and lead athletes to feel motivated and comfortable to take risks. We're going to quickly take another look at our UW volleyball friends, and the audio in this clip is a bit tough to understand. So I'll repeat what the coach says afterwards, but if you can, try to pay particular attention to the specific language that the coach is using here.
okay? Make sure you get to the point of failure. You know, if you bury one in the net, it's okay. Uh-oh. One more.
Notice how the coach here says, if you bury one in the net, that's okay. By doing this, we're helping athletes feel confident and encouraged and not stressed and fearful of making mistakes. Through our communication, we can intentionally facilitate an environment that reduces anxiety and an environment where athletes and staff feel valued, respected, and appreciated. And having an environment like this makes it easy to have fun. I mentioned that my first coaching experience was with the women's club basketball team at UConn, and I kind of just fell into this situation. Couple things to note about the dynamics of this team were that these were college students who were paying to be a part of a team. They had to pay for uniforms and travel and officials. Some of you may be familiar with how the club sports scene works. The players on the team, some of them were older than me and had been on this team for 3 or 4 years already. And I only briefly knew some of them from having played pickup with them at the rec center. They had asked a graduate assistant from the D1 team to help coach them because they were looking for this improved experience. And she then asked me to help her out. But when she became busy traveling and completing her grad program, I kind of just became the primary coach. So recognizing the dynamics at play and having kind of fallen into the situation, I figured I would start by asking the team what their goals were. The responses were things like, well, we want a coach who cares because last year our coach would always show up hungover and unprepared. They wanted to be competitive. They knew they could hoop, but they hadn't been very good. And they said they wanted to have fun because the coach in previous years had made it an annoying experience. So provided I lay off the tequila, this sounded like some pretty easy goals to work with. I recognized that my priorities were to facilitate an enjoyable experience while still providing an environment for them to develop their skills to compete. So as a result, it was easy for me to be aware that I should constantly frame my communications in a positive manner. As I developed my practice plans, I would ask the players what they wanted to work on, and I would allow them the space to try new things and be creative. They were talented, but because of this poor culture they had in the past, they were not fully comfortable working together in a 5-on-5 setting. So I diagnosed that we needed to emphasize teamwork within our drills. We started sequencing them, playing 2v2 mini games, then 3v3, and working our way up. And while I would provide feedback about technical and tactical skills, I would also ask them for feedback on how they liked what we were doing, because after all, this was meant for them to be having a fun and improved experience. We also developed a couple routines. We began practice every day with a shooting competition, and players would rotate who got to control the speaker. So I heard a bunch of songs that I had never heard before. And then the younger players who lived on campus would fortunately swipe the older players, and myself included, into the dining hall for free meals, which was a perfect time for relationship building. So fast forward to the end of the season, we had won some games and narrowly lost a few that we felt we should have won, including when I called a stupid timeout right before one of our players banked in a three-pointer. But we were having fun and we were playing well. And we had the opportunity to go to the national club tournament at Ohio State, where we won all of our pool play games, got a bye, and made it into the Elite Eight. The coolest part about this experience, however, was what happened after. Although shortly after the season, I graduated and was no longer part of the team, the culture that we established was. They proceeded to make the Elite Eight again the next 2 years, and I'd received texts from some of the players thanking me for my involvement, even though I was a couple thousand miles away. I tell this story to show you how integrated the ambitious coaching core practices can be to building a strong team culture, and to emphasize the importance of an environment that values enjoyment and fun. And these are lessons that apply outside of just the collegiate club sports scene. When something's fun, it's in our human nature to want to be a part of it. And we're more likely to be actively engaged in the space we enjoy being in. More likely to be disengaged in a space where we're not having fun. And creating a space where people feel valued, trusted, and safe makes it easier to have fun. Just because a culture is intentional about being enjoyable does not mean that the teams or athletes are not competitive or not high performing. And we could run a whole session on this. Athletes that enjoy their experience are more likely to perform better and less likely to be injured. And staff members that enjoy their experience are more likely to be productive and less likely to burn out. It's also more fun for you as the leader. So it's an all-around better experience. So we've thrown a lot at you. Thank you all for sticking with it. We're going to have one more session, which I highly encourage you to stick around for. And as you think about how you can integrate ambitious coaching core practices into your own coaching, remember that there is no one way to coach or lead. Each of you are going to have your own approach, and that is okay. Be yourself. The specifics behind how your culture is developed and maintained will look different based on your environment, your athletes, and you being you. So let's take another opportunity to reflect. And this time we'll consider the following. What is a routine that you can use to strengthen your team culture? So find that napkin or piece of paper and just try and write one thing down. Cool. Well, I hope you extend your reflections today beyond just the brief amounts of time that we set aside for them. And I also really hope that you stick around for the last part of this session because it's going to be awesome. So back to you, Hannah.
Thanks, Dylan. I appreciate it. We've been talking more broadly about culture up to this point, and now we're going to get into some of the challenges that are specific to women and what women bring to culture building and how as a community we may be able to address some of these challenges. I dropped it in the chat, but Dylan and I, not surprisingly, are two of the talkers in our office. And it looks like we're going to be going a little bit over. So we certainly want to respect your time. If you have to be somewhere at 1 o'clock, if you're able to stay with us, we would love to have you here. So our portfolio of activity at the center includes conducting coach trainings, some of which are designed specifically for women in coaching. And we call these workshops, We Are Game Changers. Through these events, we've dialogued with hundreds of coaches, learning more about the common issues that women face in coaching and administrative roles. And there are a few that are particularly salient when thinking about building culture that I'd like to share with you. And it just so happens that these challenges are backed by research, which just makes my little higher education heart sing. So in sport, an authoritative or more masculine style of leadership has been normalized. And so the belief that to coach effectively means asserting control, establishing your dominance, using a big, loud, booming voice, it's really archaic and has been completely debunked by loads and loads of research defining what makes good coaching, but it's still pervasive and it still exists. Our little old study, the Ambitious Coaching Project, looked at this, and we, in fact, know without a doubt that a focus on social emotional development and holistic well-being is central to creating spaces where athletes feel belonging and are able to flourish. And you know what happens when athletes are in a positive culture, that they feel a sense of belonging and feel safe? They perform better. How about that? Well, despite knowing that this focus on social emotional learning is central to athlete development and high performing teams, when women choose to lead with a more holistic framing, a few things tend to happen. First, you have to make your case over and over again with athletes, parents, administrators, and any other stakeholders who happen to take issue with your approach. No, I do not need to scream to get my point across. Yes, I am able to coach like this and still be tough and develop your skills at a really high level. No, it's not a waste of time to talk about how you're feeling before a big game instead of taking extra reps. Holding the social emotional flag is exhausting, and the continual debate about why you won't put it down is equally exhausting. A second layer of this issue that we've heard from women coaches is that their technical and tactical expertise is questioned. So there's this assumption that when women focus on what have been deemed soft skills, it's because they don't know their X's and O's and are choosing to shy away from them. You have no idea how irate this makes me, and it's such a crock. We know that women know their stuff. And as we've learned from ambitious coaching research, the most effective coaches are those that can balance the technical and tactical knowledge with social emotional development, have them balance and drive one another. And lastly, if you were at the leadership conference, the Women in Sport Leadership Conference in November, you learn that women are rated higher in measures of caring and compassion as components of leadership. And we know that these characteristics specifically are foundational in relationship building and connection, which ties directly to what we're talking about today, the development of positive culture. Great, right? Women have those things. Well, kind of. The issue lies in that women are expected to display these characteristics, but they don't get credit for it because it's part of their DNA or should be part of their DNA. So women must live in a space where they provide the emotional labor for the athletes, but then aren't recognized for the work. And when a man demonstrates these skills, he's celebrated for his focus on care and compassion. So as my buddy, Dr. McCleary stated in her November keynote, it's okay to lead like a woman, you just can't be one. This double bind presents itself in another specific way, as research shows that many female athletes report preferring male coaches. Where does this preference come from? Well, research suggests it emanates from what I've just described, a flawed logic that men have higher sport acumen and are better leaders because of the authoritative leadership style that's been normalized in sport. This is a distinct challenge that women have to take on the minute they walk through the door, because if you even have a shot at shifting or building culture and the athletes don't want you there in the first place, the road to cultural buy-in is long and rocky. It's also not a stretch to imagine that many girls simply haven't had a woman coach or a very limited experience with a woman coach, because only 25% of roles are filled by women. This was my experience. I've played every sport imaginable since I could walk, was a 3-sport athlete through high school. And besides a few seasons playing for my mom when I was young, shout out to Amy O, I only had one female coach in 15 years of participation. We relate to what we've experienced. If you need any help thinking about how to have a conversation with athletes to shift perspective around women's coaches, our colleagues at the University of Minnesota's Tucker Center have a wonderful resource, and we'll share that in the chat. My final point, as we consider culture building challenges specific to women, is tied to emotional intelligence and self-awareness. Shifting, building, cultivating culture, it's incredibly hard work for any leader in any context. I suggested earlier in my remarks that coaches and folks in leadership positions must put on their detective hats, get curious, and search that darn iceberg. We have to look below the waterline to see where culture is being developed and bring it to the surface. What cues do I see from others that provide insight into the culture? And how is my behavior impacting what is happening? Both the Harvard Business Review and Korn Ferry International, industry leaders in research around leadership, report that women score higher on nearly all emotional intelligence competencies and have greater self-awareness than their male peers. They're also ranked higher by direct reports in measures of both of those things. This can create a challenge for women as we're more likely to be critical of ourselves and our ability to impact the environment that we're in, and more acutely aware of how each and every team member is reacting to the environment. Those two factors combined are a really heavy emotional lift. And as we manage the multiple demands of coaching or administration, it's really challenging as we manage culture building. A presentation about culture would be remiss if it didn't zoom out to the bigger picture to consider the pervasive culture of sport, one of which women historically have not been welcome. While we continue to make gains, 2020 was actually a great year for some firsts for the women's in the sports world. We just have a long way to go. Sexism and misogyny remain rampant in athletics. I've experienced this firsthand over and over again in small doses and large, working in professional sports and being asked to pretty myself up for game days, or someone asking who's in charge, making the assumption that I couldn't possibly be the head coach. And as we currently sit, there just aren't a lot of women around, and most fellow coaches, officials, and decision makers do not look like you and me. In fact, for a story that I'm about to share, I look like this. Not too many carbs, just 8 months pregnant. Much of my experience as a very pregnant coach was positive. Parents giving me a "you go girl" as I'm hitting infield, opposing team players giving me a "cool," seeing that women could actually still coach while pregnant, like only teenagers can do, stuff like that. Concurrently, I also experienced a lot of comments that season about the inappropriateness of me being on the field and that I needed to be more careful in my body. I shrugged most of those things off, but I had an interaction with an umpire late in our season that sticks with me to this day. Excuse me. I'm going to call this umpire Tom, and Tom missed a big call in a big game for us. And it wasn't just that me and Tom had a difference of opinion, but that he didn't actually know the rule in question. And he refused to pick up the rule book at my request. I was unhappy, but I didn't raise my voice. I didn't question his authority. I simply asked that he refer to the rule book because he owed it to the athletes to get the ruling correct. As I experienced with many male umpires over the years, he started expressing that I wasn't in a position to question his expertise. I suppose my experience as a collegiate and professional athlete and my years of coaching at the collegiate, international, and youth level don't make me qualified. Okay, Tom. Blue then proceeded to tell me something along the lines of, it must be hard for me to stay under control with all those hormones in my body and because of my belly, and threatened to eject me from the game if I didn't return to the third base coaching box. Tom, don't unleash the dragon, man, like especially a pregnant dragon. These situations are impossible to navigate as a woman and often feel like no win. Do I have the energy to fight this? Is this the hill that I'm choosing to die on? Is it really that important? These questions and the psychological gymnastics that come along with them are tremendously challenging. With that said, I'd posit it's imperative that we model behavior that challenges scenarios of sexism and misogyny, not only for ourselves, but for the young girls and boys that are watching us. We must choose the path of leadership. Even though it can be exhausting and infuriating, In the story I described with Tom, I'd like to tell you that I was cool, calm, collected, but in actuality, I was just pretty flustered and I yelled a lot. One of those moments that I'm not super proud of, and I think of 100 things later that I would have said or done better after the fact. And while I didn't handle the confrontation with Tom ideally, I did have a pair of wins afterwards. I stopped by my AD's office the following day and shared what had happened. And I asked him about contacting the official's office to file a formal complaint. He supported and he helped facilitate it, which was great allyship. I also debriefed what had happened with my athletes at practice, taking it as an opportunity to have a conversation about gender and gender norms. Initially, I was not sure if that was the right move. Am I making too much of this? Is it too much about me? But the conversation with those young women was incredible. And I'd come to find out had impact. Later that week, one of the players approached a male teacher who continually spoke over her in class. To the teacher's credit, he was receptive and responded positively. Another player confronted a group of her male peers, a pack of high school boys that watched most of our home games, and asked them to quit catcalling our team and opposing players. Don't talk about us like that. Don't talk about our bodies, she said. Young people are watching, and allow them to see you challenging norms and advocating for what's right and fair. Lead from where you are. So what do we do about all of this? These are complex challenges without simple solutions. So to suggest one-dimensional strategies does not seem appropriate nor useful. Thus, I'd offer an approach that we might all consider to help disrupt current practices in athletic settings. We must unapologetically share the narrative around the importance of having women in leadership positions when they can actively shape sport culture, both within their teams and their departments, and more broadly in society. How? So glad you asked. On an individual level, become comfortable and sound in your own leadership, regardless of how masculine or feminine your approach may be interpreted by others. If your approach does center compassion and empathy, share a compelling message about the value of focusing on social emotional development in order to elicit peak performance in your athletes. And be sure to tell them how well you do it. If your expertise is challenged, be firm in what you bring to the table and confirm that you're there for a reason. And when it comes to direct interaction with your athletes, talk to them about gendered experiences, about their own leadership, about the connection between care, compassion, and performance, about becoming a coach. All these conversations are touch points to develop a culture that values women and creates alignment between our beliefs of empowerment and our actions. Young people, girls and boys, are listening and they're ready to carry the torch. As a community, we have a great start by bringing together this group to unpack challenges and opportunities we have as change agents in sport. I applaud the work of organizations like the Global Community of Women in High School Sports and the Women of WIAA group who've laid the groundwork for sustained connection and communication. We must continue the work by finding co-conspirators and allies who will help us amplify the message of equity and create a culture where women are supported to thrive. When there's a coaching vacancy, ensure that women are being considered for the job. Get creative on how to write job descriptions that are more inclusive for women. No or few women in the applicant pool? Look harder and tap new avenues for recruitment. Back the new coaches you bring in through mentorship and learning communities. Create infrastructure to support all women with programming that responds to issues they're facing in the field. Find an all-star or two and champion them. Keep these women front of mind for any and all leadership and professional development opportunities you come across. Their victories are our victories. And for the love of everything holy, find your support system. This work can be exhausting, and the importance of knowing who your people are can keep you in the game, even when it seems nearly impossible. All of these actions create a culture where the capabilities and qualifications of women are valued and honored. This is the work we must do if we're serious about permanently shifting the culture towards a place of equity. I started this session with a comment that we're in a moment, and I truly believe that. While 2020 brought pain and sadness to many, I do think it afforded the opportunity to hit the pause button. For me, the pause created space to imagine possibility and how to move forward towards real and tangible change. Now I'm hitting the play button. I got my finger on fast forward because I'm tired of being patient and I'm tired of waiting for my turn. Tired of watching women get passed over for leadership roles. Tired of my graduate students being mistreated in athletic departments with archaic ideologies. Tired of being told I'm bossy or a bitch. Tired of women dropping out of athletics because they don't have support. Just tired. My daughter is a kindergartner and I want better for her. In sport, yes, but across the board as a young girl, learning to take up space in the world. So I'm motivated, I'm energized, I'm hopeful, and I got my mean streak in my reserves if I need it, because the time is now for you and me, and she's depending on us. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Hannah, for the inspiration, and thanks, Hannah and Dylan, for just the motivational thoughts and the practical ideas. It was great, and it was wonderful to see so many of you here. Thanks for being here. I just have some resources to share before we move to the breakout sessions and the networking session. So just in case you want to learn more about some of these topics, we have the center has an ambitious coaching podcast. We recently dropped a 3-part series specifically focusing on the needs of female athletes that you all might find interesting. It's with Sam Moore, North Carolina State strength and conditioning coach, who I think is also on the call. So thanks, Sam. And Brooke, thanks for adding that in. And then this Saturday, some of you may have heard we're partnering again with the WIAA. Yay, awesome partnership with the WIAA to do a return to play coach training. Oh my gosh, these seasons that you all have coming up, 7-week seasons with kids who have been inactive and who are struggling. We want to help you make it psychologically and physically safe for them to return to play and to perform well and enjoy themselves, because they very much need that right now. So those are 2 events that we have coming up, and I think we will skip the break. Yes, and go right to we're gonna, Dr. Sarah Lopez, who's the director of the Center for Leadership in Athletics, is going to walk you all through some reflection questions for our remaining 15 minutes here for the networking and conversation. So thanks all. Sarah, hopefully is here.
Thanks for being here today, and hope you've gotten some good ideas. We've got about 15 minutes. If you need to run,